Hello everybody, welcome back. I'm Lisa with Lisa Capen Quilts. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the mystery quilt that we started last week. If you missed that video, that's okay. I'm going to put a link down in the description box, and this video is going to go in that playlist. We started a mystery quilt where we're painting by numbers or painting by letters. 5 puzzle pieces each week for 5 weeks. It's going to make an awesome 20-inch by 20-inch art quilt when we're done. Now, many of you have asked during the live chat and even after the video is over, can I use fabric instead of paint? And while I highly encourage you to try the fabric paint, if you've never done it before, it is your quilt. And if you want to use fabric, then by all means, use the fabric, right? I think we all have an abundance of fabric that we could use in place of paint if that's the way you want to go. Now, when we talk about working with fabric in this kind of art quilt, I think there's probably a million different ways you could do it. So I'm going to show you how I would approach making the pieces if I were using fabric instead of paint. But just know this is one way to do it. And if this way does not work for you, then by all means, keep experimenting, keep searching on YouTube and Googling all the different ways that you might be able to do this. This is just the way that I would do it. And you just need a few things that you probably already have anyway, like a light pad or a window, a glue stick, some freezer paper. And one thing that we'll add to the fabric approach versus the paint is some tulle at the very end. Now, many of you have seen the mosaic art quilt videos that I have here on my channel. Y'all, there's lots of other videos on YouTube about doing mosaic art quilts and using tulle. But that's how I would treat this quilt if I were using fabric with it instead of paint. I would gather some tulle, and I'll show you that at the end of today's video. I'm going to try to keep it super short and simple and just walk you through the steps so that you can get started with your fabric making these puzzle pieces. Let's go turn on the light pad. If I were using fabric instead of paint to do my pieces, instead of white fabric squares, I would cut my squares out of black fabric instead. I would still put the freezer paper on the back to stabilize the fabric squares while tracing. Now, to trace my pieces, we would need to see our tracing, right? So I'm going to use a chalk marker. You could use a white heat erasing pen. You could even use like a sliver of soap or tailor's chalk, something that'll show up on the black fabric. And now you can trace your pieces like we would if we're using the white fabric in the paint, right? Trace your pieces just like this. The very next thing we want to do is make little template pieces of all of those individual pieces within each one of our squares, right? So I'm still using freezer paper and I'm tracing on the dull side. With a ballpoint pen, I'm going to go in and trace the outline of each one of these pieces. Now, using fabric in this method, I am going to also write down the letter within each one of these pieces. And I'm even going to number them because within each piece, you might have multiple pieces of the same color, right? So this is going to help me keep track of which piece goes where. And I'm also extending the shape to the outside line, not that inner 4.5 by 4.5 inch line, but I'm extending my pieces to the very outside line. That's going to ensure that the raw edges, when we piece all these pieces together, the raw edges within each piece are sewn into that seam allowance. And then we can separate each one of these pieces. At this point, we're not cutting out directly on the line. We're giving ourselves a little bit of extra space around each piece. And now we can bring our pieces with the different colors of fabric. We're going to put the fabric with the pretty side, the right side up. We're going to fuse our piece directly to the right side. I like to use the cotton setting on my iron with no steam when fusing my pieces down. You'll see I have all of my colors off to the side. I usually have all my pieces prepared, and then I fuse them all to the fabrics while I'm here at the iron. At this point, they're just in chunks, and then we'll cut everything apart out here in just a second. So I just fuse all of my pieces. And once you have all of your pieces on the fabrics, we can go ahead and cut them out. And this time, we're cutting directly on the traced line, separating these pieces and cutting them out on the line. So I just go through, separate each piece. Just like you see me doing here. This method is great if you have a great big stash of scrap fabrics that you don't know what to do with. This would be time to break out those scraps. So once you have your pieces cut out, you can bring in your little fabric map and your piece and start lining up. And you'll see right here, see that extra? The extra I added beyond the actual true 2-size piece. That extra is going to go in our seam allowance. For this method, I'm just going to use a glue stick, and you'll notice I'm not extending the glue stick right to the edge of each one of my pieces. I think sometimes when you use a glue stick right on the edge, it does cause it to fray a little bit sometimes. I guess it depends on the fabric you're using, but I just put a little bit of glue in the center of my pieces and lay them right down. Having them numbered and numbering your map of where the pieces go really helps when you have multiple A's, multiple C's, multiple B's. I just glue all of my pieces to the fabric and then cover that up with just an extra scrap piece of fabric and give that a good press and dry that glue. Now you can just take a pin and lift off the freezer paper. It should just pop off of there. You can take off the freezer paper and discard that at this time. And there's your puzzle piece. Now let's just pretend that our quilt is all pieced together. 25 pieces all pieced together, and our quilt top is 20 inches by 20 inches, right? We're just going to pretend here. So with the fabric with the raw edges, you see I did not extend my glue all the way to the edges of each piece. I didn't want those raw edges to unravel as much as I could prevent it. And so we have all of these raw edges just exposed on our quilt top, right? So we're going to layer our quilt. You'll put the backing down like normal and your batting, and you'll center your quilt top right on the top. Before you move any further, we're going to top coat this with some tulle, and you can use all different colors of tulle. I like to pick a tulle that kind of just disappears when you place it over top of your art quilt, right? So you would just layer a piece of tulle right over the entire top of your quilt. See how that just sort of disappears? You're going to base that in place, and then you're going to quilt your quilt as normal. Now the cool thing about covering it or layering it with a top coat of tulle is that you do not now have to stitch down the raw edges of each one of these pieces. The tulle's going to keep that in place. So if you wanted to do a simple meandering or a stitch in the ditch, maybe a straight line quilting in the black space around all of your pieces, that's all you would have to do. You don't have to meticulously go in and get all of the edges of each one of the pieces in this entire quilt. So if you're going to make this mystery quilt out of fabric, those are the steps that I would take to do it. And of course, if you do it with fabric or you do it with paint, I would love to see it. You could share pictures over on the Creative Crew. There's a link down in the description box to do that. That's kind of pretty, right? Yes, maybe we'll do the next one with fabric. All right, everybody, until I see you on Friday, I hope you have a fantastic week, and I hope this was helpful. Bye, everybody.